I would like to ask each of you, and then we'll come to the specifics of the withdrawal and the options. I'd like to ask you to place yourselves somewhere along the spectrum of opinion on specifically whether or not the withdrawal was wise and timely and appropriate. And more importantly than that, whether you find, if you were in favor of the withdrawal at this time, whether you were in favor of the withdrawal at all costs, including the heavily criticized manner that we're seeing it play out today, or whether you were in favor of a much more balanced, much more staggered, much better thought out, frankly, according to perceptions, withdrawal. Where are you on that spectrum? Are you pleased everybody's out and the costs almost be damned? Or do you feel that there ought to have been a much better orchestrated withdrawal? And I'd like to pitch that to actually John, please, if you would weigh in on that.
Sure. And I guess the distinction I make in my mind when thinking about this is something that Micah brings up in his article on the question of a permanent presence or an eventual withdrawal. I think those are almost two best described as mutually exclusive options. And so in my mind, I lean much more in favor in terms of a withdrawal in the immediate term. And so I am in favor of President Biden's decision. Certainly we can go into detail on whether or not the execution has been up to standard. And I think the consensus there is that most certainly has been mishandled at some levels, and we're continuing to remediate that on the ground in real time. But I think, and Benjamin, this is something that I've discussed with you before. I came home from my deployment in 2018, a bit disillusioned with our mission in Afghanistan, quite frankly. I felt like, although we did have an important job of keeping Kandahar airfield safe and secure, I did question the efficacy of our work in training the locals at the local training centers outside of the airfield as part of the SFAB concept within General Milley's framework. And so the best way, and again, appreciating that I was at a very tactical level and not necessarily in the room for the conversations related to strategy, but even from my vantage point, it was clear that we were teetering between an extended campaign pushing us out as far as 2030 or withdrawal conversations. And in my view, it feels like we've been having withdrawal conversations for the longest time. And I think you trace initial withdrawal conversations all the way back to Colonel Collins' days, after some would argue we had initially achieved a foothold and destroyed the bulk of al-Qaeda in Afghanistan. And so in my view, the withdrawal is long overdue. I'm glad that it's been fully implemented. I think there is no good time for a withdrawal, as President Biden alluded to in his remarks. And in some ways, he's left holding the bag, so to speak. But I commend his decision, and I look forward to continuing to apply pressure to Afghanistan, its adversaries, its allies, and finding ways by diplomatic or economic means to support the people of Afghanistan in the best way we know how, and ideally avoid any other military conflict on the ground, and certainly any subsequent invasions on the U.S.'s behalf.
Liam, if you have objections, are they to a withdrawal? In other words, are you in favor of there being a residual force or a peacekeeping force? Or are your objections largely surrounding the manner of the withdrawal? Or indeed, do you have no objections to what you're seeing and what was decided?
No, I mean, I'm kind of agree with John on the point. I mean, I think it's time to go. It was probably time to go sooner. I mean, at the same time, I wouldn't oppose some kind of an international, right, if they needed some kind of international peacekeeping force there, right, a UN type of force, right, that was agreed to stay there to provide some kind of security. But right, a US-led mission there, I mean, 20 years, I think is more than enough time. As Biden laid out, I mean, we gave them ample time building up their military, trying to build up their governance. We can't just stay there forever. So, yeah, I mean, could it have been executed better? No doubt. But I think it's time. It was time to go.
So Micah, I want to come back to you because in your opinion piece that was featured in Newsweek, and people can read it on the MirYam Institute website, you actually wrote, and I'm quoting you, besides the incomprehensible human suffering that will undoubtedly unfold, particularly for Afghan women and minorities, I am disgusted by the damage that America's retreat, you phrase it as a retreat, has already done to the United States' credibility among both its allies and enemies alike. I left Afghanistan truly believing that America and its NATO allies were genuinely improving the lives of the Afghan people. Now, Micah, we've seen the images from the airport and we've followed the suffering and sacrifice in Afghanistan over the years. You used the word disgusted to express your reaction at this time. Is that to a withdrawal or is it to the manner of withdrawal? And you've heard your colleagues, John and Liam. Where are you on that issue?
So it's both. It's both. I have felt gut punched for the last week, really, since Kabul has fallen and was on the precipice of falling. I want to take your question, if it's okay, Benjamin, in two parts. On the concept of the withdrawal itself, I'm vehemently against it. And I stand by everything I wrote in that article in regards to the why. But to reiterate, for those people who have not yet read it, I really do believe that the lift in regards to maintaining the minimal security presence in Afghanistan was extremely minor compared to the calamity that is now, and that will, in my opinion, undoubtedly unfold now that we have literally given billions of dollars worth of equipment to a terrorist organization, Taliban, and have put them in a better position than they were at 2001 with a absolute galvanization of radical fundamentalist jihadist groups that are now pouring into the country and will absolutely use Afghanistan as a staging area to terrifyingly probably launch attacks against the United States and our allies in the West. So in regards to the concept of the withdrawal, I'm against it because I think people fail to take the context in of just how many American forces collectively the world over are forward deployed. I really encourage everyone listening on the call to look up how many troops we have currently stationed in Korea, how many troops we have in Japan, how many we have in the Philippines, how many we have in Germany, how many we have in Italy. And yes, granted, all the countries I just named are not active combat zones, but they were at one point, and they have, based on that, in my opinion, persistent U.S. presence, maintained peace for now going on 70 years in some cases or more. For me, and when really looking at statistics, Afghanistan had really become a peacekeeping mission in the sense that there had been no combat fatalities since 2020, and the amount of troops needed on the ground to maintain that peace, a stalemate, and I fully admit it is a stalemate, was very minor. And so I really I want to paraphrase from the video of the British Member of Parliament, Tom Tugendhat, and I encourage everybody to look that video up as well, in which he used the term patient peace rather than a forever war. And that's something that I truly believed in and felt that was something that was certainly something that we could maintain. In regards to how the withdrawal now is being conducted, I once again could not disagree possibly any more with how the Biden administration has approached this. They have failed on all accounts. And once again, I encourage everybody to go back and look at the New York Times piece from April of this year, in which it clearly shows that this decision is completely on Biden, completely on the Biden administration, and ignoring his generals and ignoring all available intelligence assets on the ground. I think right now what we have is basically 98% to the absolute worst case scenario, with 100% worst case scenario happening when, and God forbid it does happen, when the 10,000 American citizens that are currently stranded in Afghanistan are potentially kidnapped or put in harm's way, and not to mention the 100,000 SIV eligible applicants and interpreters who helped soldiers on the ground in Afghanistan for the last 20 years are most likely going to be murdered and have absolutely terrible fates because we left them and betrayed our allies.
So, John, Liam, I'm going to come back to you about a point that Micah just mentioned with regard to other forces elsewhere in the world. But John, I want you to talk about a statement or a comment made within the broader statement of President Biden. You said that you largely endorse his decision, contrary to Micah's view. And during his speech in the White House, he expressed that he had a binary choice. I'm quoting him now. He said, "When I came into office, there was only the cold reality of either following through on the agreement to withdraw our forces or escalating the conflict and sending thousands more American troops back into combat in Afghanistan, lurching into the third decade of conflict. Are you of the view that it was indeed a binary choice, John? Is that what you're hearing in the community? Do you feel that it was either withdraw completely or recommit heavily? Or do you view what Micah's saying as legitimate, namely that this was largely actually a peacekeeping mission by this stage in the Afghanistan War, and it could have been sustained as a patient peace?
Yeah, thank you for that question, Benjamin. I do think the Biden framework is appropriate here, and I commend Micah for his piece. He gives Colonel Collins and myself the benefit of being able to reflect on it privately before speaking to it, and so we are, I think, at a bit of an advantage in that respect. And so, like in Micah's piece, for example, I would say he does concede that total victory over the Taliban would never occur. I believe the term uses that decisive victory against the Taliban was never going to happen. And so my question would be, what would a partial victory look like in that case? And so I do see this as a binary. I do think the characterization of our 2020 efforts as a peacekeeping mission is a bit of a mischaracterization. I very much see the 2020 efforts as not a peacekeeping mission, but a withdrawal mission, starting with the agreement in February of 2020, where President Trump and advisors came to meet with the Taliban and agreed to begin releasing prisoners on a conditional basis under the supervision of President Ghani in Afghanistan. Any other way to cut it? And I think that the withdrawal plan was already in place. The train was already leaving the station. And so I think Biden is correct in framing it in that regard.
Liam, one more question on this aspect of a binary choice or not. I'm going to quote General Petraeus, and he, in a recent interview, said the following: the outcome, he's referring to, I think, the nature of the withdrawal more than anything else, quote, "The outcome is catastrophic, it's heartbreaking, it's tragic, and there were alternative approaches that could have been considered. Afghan soldiers fought and died in huge numbers over the past 2 decades. So the idea that they would not fight for their country is simply not accurate." That seems to be broadly aligned with what Micah's saying. Where are you between John's view, Micah's view, and General Petraeus's view?
Yeah, I mean, like I said before, I mean, I fall more into John's camp. I mean, how much more investment can we do in them? And right, they show all the right. Everybody's seeing the images or the videos at the airport. I have to question it. Why couldn't they put that much effort into fighting the Taliban as they are at the airport? I mean, the Taliban is not a massive army that's a well-equipped, well-trained force, right? It's more than capable, obviously, in Afghanistan, but much like in Iraq with the Islamic State, when the military just folds, it's pretty easy to take over. And so, they had the capability to fight off the Taliban, and they chose not to. Very disappointing. And to go back to the Taliban, speaking of the Taliban, Micah referred to them as a terrorist organization. I don't think most people would classify them as a terrorist organization. I mean, extremely brutal, repressive regime. When they were in power before, there's no reason, despite their rhetoric, to believe that they've changed. Right, Haqqani Network, terrorist organization, Al Qaeda, terrorist organization. Right, they've got the Department of State designation, but Taliban really hasn't employed terrorism in the same way.
And Liam, now coming to something strategic that Micah alluded to, he spoke about the U.S. presence in Japan, the long-term U.S. presence in South Korea, the long-term U.S. presence in Germany. This is my perception of that. Those countries became true allies of the United States of America over a long enough trajectory. Afghanistan did not seem to be moving in that direction at all. I'm, from my own perspective, not of the opinion that it ever would have done. So again, in his article, Micah expressed that he believed that that the U.S. continued presence in Afghanistan had been successful in preventing the Taliban and Al Qaeda from ever being strong enough to recreate a 9/11 level attack on American soil. Micah, I'd just like you to come back, because Liam's parsed out the distinction between a regime and a terrorist organization. Assess for us the level of threat as you see it of a recurrence on domestic US soil that is, if not facilitated, has its passage eased somewhat by way of a total absence of an American presence on the ground in Afghanistan.
Yes, no, I do think that. I think what we've created, I'm somebody who does think that Afghanistan is a strategic part of the world, particularly with land borders to Iran and China, and us having forward deployed bases there allows us to force project throughout all the Middle East and near Asia. So I very much respect your research, Liam, but I do disagree with you that I think that that Afghanistan is a very strategic place. In regards to it now being a safe harbor for potential terrorist organizations that are given safe harbor by the Taliban and their new government, I do think that is the case. That is initially why we went in 2001, and when the Taliban would not hand over Osama bin Laden after Al-Qaeda and the terrorist attacks on 9/11. I do think that is a high possibility now of at least giving shelter and safe harbor to radical jihadist groups the world over. They are energized, and there is, at least in the many articles I've read, a lot of jihadis that were going to Syria, that were going to Iraq and other hotspots in the world are now coming to Afghanistan because they see the Taliban having a strategic victory against the most powerful army in the history of the world, the United States of America, and seeing how the Taliban, a bunch of ragtag barbarians, are keeping much of Kabul and U.S. forces at a stalemate and in kind of a very difficult situation, a very difficult situation. I also, if I get the opportunity, push back a little bit on what John said in regards to the Trump level plan negotiated by Pompeo. And I just want to emphasize, I really would encourage people to go back and kind of look at that agreement and look what was in that, and specifically the contingencies, and the fact that, in my opinion, that plan was going to fail completely because the Taliban were already breaking many of the contingencies that had been set by Pompeo and the negotiations. I'm somebody who did not like the fact that we were negotiating with the Taliban at all. But when you look at that deal, it was an engagement in which the Taliban started executing captured Afghan soldiers and commandos, which has happened. There's terrible video on the internet of that deal would start to fall apart. I also believe that the undercutting that occurred in regards to the timeline that the administration, that the Biden administration pushed forward, was completely haphazard and really ignored the realities on the ground in regards to the fighting season, in regards to the capabilities of the Afghan community that was supported by international and U.S. contractors. And so everything that they did to, even if they were going to go forward with the plan, was a precipitous pullout that really failed to acknowledge the realities on the ground.
Liam, I want to ask you a quick question, please, if I may, and then I'm going to come back to you, John, with something separate. You know, I live in a country, I'm currently in the United States, but I live in the States of Israel, and I served in the military of the State of Israel. And one of the basic tenets of our national security policy is that we are able to defend ourselves by ourselves. That's one of the reasons that we've resisted, for example, international forces coming and implementing various resolutions to the Israel-Palestinian conflict. Who will do the fighting when the fighting starts? You are, and I don't say this to in any way cause you embarrassment, it's very, very clear to me that you are someone of legendary status in terms of your special operations background. I imagine that you work closely with Afghan forces while you were on the ground over there. The reality is that nobody's questioning whether or not the Afghans fought in this particular round effectively against the Taliban. The answer is that they did not. Were they ever going to get to a place, in your opinion, where they could be expected to hold the ground, to hold the line, and actually to secure their country if left to do so? And their failure to have done so on this occasion, do you lay the blame for that at the feet of the US withdrawal, or do you think this is just not a group of individuals who are ever going to get to the position that the US may have hoped to bring them to?
Yeah, I mean, it's a tough question to answer, but I think we're overly focused on today without understanding why we are at the position we are today. And I think two primary things have produced this outcome, right? If it wasn't today, right, we're going to have this discussion 5 years ago, or we'd have this discussion 5 years in the future. but we were going to have the discussion. I think if you go back to 2002, when we switched from really a special operations forces led effort in Afghanistan with the conventional army taking it over, which I attribute that really to the feeling, right? They wanted to get into the fight and they were afraid they were going to miss it. And so inserting large number of U.S. forces in Afghanistan, which I don't think ever needed to be done. That's one thing. And then two, right, the drafting of the Constitution in 2003 that was implemented in 2004 that basically consolidated the power at the central government, which anybody that understands, right, Afghanistan, that's not how that works, right? That just leads to corruption, all these issues that we, absorbed since then. And then really this hyper focus on creating a national army for them, as opposed to, right, regional security forces. By the time we started looking at local defense initiatives, taking a real look at it, wasn't until the village stability operations and Afghan local police efforts in probably about 2009 time period, I think, is when that program started, right? But it took 8 years to get to that. And when that program should have been built from the beginning, right? But if you left power, right, kind of, okay, focus on Kabul, stabilizing that, and then really look at regional things. But right, once again, we kind of mirror imaged and created a force and a government that was similar to what we have that doesn't work for that region or that part of the world. And trying to do that really produce the outcome that we have today, right? If we had a smaller footprint there, then maybe we wouldn't be so worried about, right? Maybe we'd still have 2,500, special operations supported with whatever, right there, and we wouldn't be so worried about pulling out the forces, right? But we've invested $1 trillion to achieve arguably limited ends, right? It just doesn't make sense. But I think, right, between, right, the conventionalizing the fight there, the Constitution, and then really this focus on national army because we think militias are bad and somehow warlords are going to take control of them. I think those things are what resulted in today.
John, the president said the following. He said, quote, "We went to Afghanistan almost 20 years ago with clear goals. Get those who attacked us on September 11th, 2001, and make sure Al-Qaeda could not use Afghanistan as a base from which to attack us again." He goes on to say, quote, "We did that. We severely degraded Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan. We never gave up the hunt for Osama bin Laden, and we got him. That was a decade ago." With regard to Micah's comments about the importance of force projection, particularly when it comes to countering the threats that he believes will now only increase from within Afghanistan, that they will then export out beyond their borders, how important do you view a US presence as a bulwark against attacks on the homeland in the United States, and indeed within the homelands of allies to the United States? And with regard to Liam's comment about the sheer cost of all of this, would not the resources be better spent on building up intel capabilities, a return back to more precise strikes by way of the technological advantages that the US military enjoys, as well as the special forces capabilities? Isn't that where these funds and resources ought to now be focused, or do you take a different view?
I would say three things in response, Benjamin. Number one, we do have force projection capability throughout the Middle East beyond Afghanistan. That's just a fact. Whether it be Bahrain, Qatar, and most notably Kuwait, we do have that capability. And I'm not sure that a presence in Afghanistan gives us any more of a competitive edge in the sense that the capability already exists and we are prepared to execute on that capability. Number two, I would say, to get to where Micah is on the concern of Afghanistan being a platform for future terrorist attacks such as 9/11, I would say, 9/11 was planned at various locations in and around the Middle East. Certainly Afghanistan was a key location. But I would also say it was planned in the United States, right? We know the pilots had US-based flight training, and we know it was executed in the United States at 3 East Coast airports. So to get to where Micah is, I think you have to be seriously discounting, number one, the Department of Homeland Security, which was stood up in 2002 under the Bush administration, and what they're capable of screening for and interdicting on.
So I want to come back to you, Micah. For the purpose of the recording, I'll repeat where we were beginning. Micah, you do have some specific insights strategically here due to your position while serving in Afghanistan. You, of course, were selected to be the aide, as you said at the top, to the Brigadier General in charge of NATO's rule of law mission, and you had a privileged view of the war effort. You were also present during weekly meetings with the US ambassador to Afghanistan, to discussions with the Afghan vice president, to briefings with four-star generals. And as such, you actually had the opportunity to be a fly on the wall in the rooms where the decisions were truly being made. Now, Micah, I live in a country that has seen withdrawals from areas just beyond her borders, granted, but withdrawals nonetheless. When we withdraw, malicious, dangerous forces tend to take up the ground that we have vacated, and we pay a price for decades thereafter. Now, that's not going to be the case for the US home front, but if the US withdraws from Afghanistan, contrary to what John said, or perhaps somewhat removed a position from John's, do you see the forces of China and Iran stepping into the country that the US is now vacating? And how do you see that playing out with regard to the great power struggle, certainly where China and the US are concerned, and also, of course, the more regional considerations vis-a-vis Iran?
Yes, Benjamin, I do see other great or regional powers stepping into the vacuum that has been created within Afghanistan. On the China front, their, I think, wait and see approach with Afghanistan, as I said earlier, they do share a land border. It's very small, but they do. Also, I think China views Afghanistan probably from a much more transactional relationship through their Belt and Road system. They may offer some sort of road or just at least even internationally recognize the Taliban as in government Afghanistan. But I really think China's goal within Afghanistan may be mining the $1 trillion worth of rare earth minerals that are within that country, and then also just using it as propaganda, as we've already seen from some of the Chinese state media this week, in regards to trying to bully, intimidate America's ally in Taiwan, with showing that if America, with all of its assets in Afghanistan, does not have the stomach to either rescue the Americans that are currently trapped there, or to figure out a solution against the Taliban, how on earth are they going to stand up against People's Republic of China when they take Taiwan, which China believes is rightfully theirs? With Iran, I do not trust any of the mullahs. I believe they are nefarious, and I believe that they also will be using the absence of U.S. presence in Afghanistan to either use some of the resources that are being picked up by the Taliban. It's documented now the Taliban are in possession of drones used by American forces previously and given to the Afghans. And so I'm sure Western technology that it should not be in the hands of nefarious actors is going to either be on the black market or given to them for some sort of transaction. And projecting beyond that, I think just the showing that America is not willing to stand up for its allies and the people that worked with it is going to make it very difficult for people in the future who are kind of deciding what great power to align themselves with, whether or not the United States can be trusted. And I think out of everything, that's the biggest tragedy. And sadly, this is the end result of already a poor showing in the decade in which we've abandoned the Kurds, we've abandoned Hong Kong, and now we're abandoning our Afghan allies as well.
So Liam, a former prime minister of the state of Israel, Menachem Begin, in the context of the ongoing clashes between Iraq and Iran, once famously stated, "I wish the best of luck to both sides." Now, when you think about what Mike is saying, do you say, let the Chinese deal with the liability that is Afghanistan, let Iran deal with the liability that is Afghanistan, let them deal with that because the United States is coming out in high time that they do so? Or do you share some of Micah's considerations and fears that the vacating of that area by the US is now going to turn it into a fertile ground for the advance of China's objectives, and also that it changes the perceptions among American allies with regard to America's staying power and reliability? Incidentally, I would like you also to weigh in. It's a slight digression rather, but I would like you to weigh in on on the Taiwan issue in that context, because we recently had a conversation with General McChrystal in which he expressed that he doesn't see any scenario absent very, very significant alliances whereby the US would be poised to confront China over the issue of Taiwan, certainly kinetically.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of, I think, yes, pulling out of Afghanistan, is it going to cede influence to less than friendly states, China, Iran? I think without a doubt. I think it would be surprising if that wasn't the case, especially if we're pulling out all embassy personnel and closing up diplomatic relations with the Taliban, right? Or having a formal embassy established there, having a presence there, right? Without a doubt, we're ceding that. Again, that doesn't mean that's still maybe within our interest because it's the least bad option, but I think it is going to cede to them. In terms of Taiwan, it's just not a region, that I'm an expert on. I think there's just enough uncertainty, right, with the Chinese and generally most other nations are in for a longer game. The U.S., right, we have a shorter time horizon than most other nations. And so I think China, right, they feel they're going to get it back. I mean, they'd rather have it back today, but hey, if it takes 25 or 50 years, they can wait and hope we get tired. But I think there's enough uncertainty about what we would do in terms of coming to their defense that it's enough to deter China from taking it. If I want to go back a little bit to what John talked about earlier, about a safe haven for will Afghanistan now be a safe haven for it? And he was discounting that a little bit. Without a doubt, right? Terrorist organizations still require some kind of a physical safe haven, right? If you look at most successful bombing attempts in the U.S. or why many of them failed, right, is the bombers just didn't get that training. They can only get so much over the internet. And so, right, that's why we see some of these failed attempts in New York City. They weren't able to physically, for many of them, travel to a region to conduct that training because there was fear they'd be captured either leaving or captured coming back, which is what happens a lot of the time. And this supports what John was saying, though, right? Our domestic intelligence has gotten so good that oftentimes, at least, right, we can detect those coming in, right? So regardless of where that safe haven is physically, right, our intelligence can often detect them. And these things combine to prevent, a significant terrorist attack from a foreign terrorist organization on the U.S. soil since 9/11. And then also, right, but the pressure that we had when bin Laden was in the federally administered tribal area of Pakistan, right? If you read his own communications, right, with some of the declassified communications that he had that were captured after the Abbottabad raid, right, it was clear that there was a lot of pressure on him. And when you're spending, a week just to get a communication out, right, he was so busy trying to stay alive that he couldn't operationally plan, right? We expect to some extent, right, whatever terrorist organization is going to go to Afghanistan, use that as a safe haven, right? No doubt they can spend more time planning and less time worrying about surviving, right? But again, that doesn't mean in terms of a policy option, that's not still the better option for us, right? Just like Lebanon, right, just like Israel pulled out of Lebanon in 2000, pulled out of Gaza in 2005, right? That gave them a safe haven in which to launch rockets, do those kind of things, but it's still not in Israel's interest to go and occupy either of those, right? Either the Gaza or southern Lebanon again, right? Maybe to go do a short strike, but not to occupy those because it just isn't in their interest and it's not the best course of action.
I definitely agree that it's not within Israel's interest, nor does it have the public will and support for the state of Israel to go and remain for any length of time in southern Lebanon or in the Gaza Strip. But I want to challenge you on one aspect of what you said, and then I'd like John to weigh in on this. If terrorist organizations ultimately, as you expressed, and I'm paraphrasing, require some sort of territory out of which they can operate, do not democratic states countering the wills and ambitions of these terrorist organizations require an on-the-ground presence in order to effectively counter the same, Liam?
I mean, that's one of the things we talked about, and like again, Mike or John said earlier in the conversation about when we were talking about what was the future of Afghanistan going to look like in 2002. And at that time, one of the things we thought it was going to maintain a small presence. We didn't predict there were going to be tens of thousands of soldiers eventually going into, coalition soldiers going into Afghanistan. But right, the ability to maintain some kind of a strike capability. Right at that time, armed predators were kind of just coming right into existence, so that really wasn't an option. So at that time, it really was a physical entity that you could launch a strike operation. And given the altitude of the mountains in Afghanistan, right, in the size of the nation, right, it's tough to get a physical strike force around there. So it had to be based, right? Okay, where's it going to be based? Well, you're not going to base it in Iran, not going to base it in Pakistan. So that really leaves Afghanistan as the sole place to have that kind of a strike force. Right now, we have other capabilities to conduct drone strikes that as a mechanism to do that. So we'll see how those play out in the future. No doubt, right? If we see that as a threat, then I would be surprised if we didn't see some kind of a drone strike to eliminate those threats.
Thank you, Liam. John, just to clarify my position with regard to Israel's own withdrawals, I don't believe it's within our strategic interests. I completely agree with Liam to go back into and to take a stronghold in southern Lebanon or in the Gaza Strip. I think it was a terrible error to unilaterally withdraw. I just don't think that that's something that's easily remedied once it happens, unfortunately. And I've found that Israel's efforts at having these tactical strikes have largely proved rather ineffective, quite frankly, both in southern Lebanon and in the Gaza Strip. And I want to bring you a quote from President Biden, and it was an aspect of his statement that opposed looking backward when affixing policy as opposed to looking forward. And he said, quote, I opposed the surge that's in Afghanistan when it was proposed in 2009 when I was vice president. As president, I'm adamant that we focus on the threats we face today in 2021, not yesterday's threats. We conduct effective counterterrorism missions against terrorist groups in multiple countries where we don't have a permanent military presence. If necessary, we will do the same in Afghanistan. Firstly, I don't think that if you were to transpose that onto the Israeli map, that the Israelis, we have been particularly effective in that sense. I think that we're constantly playing a game of cat and mouse, and it's very, very problematic indeed. But John, number one, do you agree with the president's statement there? And number two, is not the enemy of yesterday the enemy of tomorrow if the United States is not there to interdict and inhibit and prevent it from re-strengthening itself and coming back at you? There's that famous adage, the US may not be interested in a given part of the globe, but that part of the globe is very interested in the United States and isn't going anywhere.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, Benjamin. I would say, the way we think about terrorist threats, the way we've thought about terrorist threats over the past 20 years will continue to be something we have to live with and reconcile and deal with. But I would also say, I think President Biden is correct in saying we also need to shift our focus to other venues of terrorist threats. One example that comes to mind is the cyber domain. And it's also a matter of what time horizon we're assessing these threats, because certainly the more we zoom out, I think the priorities would shift. And the same can be said the more we zoom in, whether we're talking about a 1-year time horizon or a 20-year time horizon or even more. I think there's a infamous quote from one of the Taliban commanders. It was in February of 2006 in a diplomatic cable to the U.S. ambassador to Afghanistan at the time, in which the Taliban commander said, "You have all the clocks, but we have all the time." And I think that is certainly true in this case, and I think that's true in China, and I think to an extent that's true in the Israeli conflicts as well. Based on the rich history in that particular region.
So I'm shifting gears now a little bit. For the latter part of this discussion, I'm going to talk more about some tactical aspects of this, also your personal experiences. In that vein, the first question I have is for you, Micah. How harmful do you feel it is to U.S. interests that U.S. military equipment has been left behind? How valuable would you assess those assets to be? And do you see those falling into the hands of not only the Taliban, but also potentially Iran, who may seek to to get hold of those. What are your thoughts on that?
Yes, absolutely. And as I mentioned previously, the Taliban have already gained via the surrendering Afghan forces drones that are certainly going to be most likely sold on the black market. They're also in possession of billions of dollars. I don't think you can actually quantify just how many arms, ammunition, vehicles are now in the hands of the Taliban regime. Not to mention our $700 million embassy it might even be $1 billion embassy in Kabul. And I do think, looking at the photos, a lot of the Taliban militants are carrying the same exact rifle setup with scope and PEC-15, the infrared laser that I carried in Afghanistan. They have the exact same weapons because, as has been previously mentioned via the conversation, the Afghan army was trained in the image of the United States and was given U.S. military equipment. So now we have essentially armed Taliban and then anybody else who allies themselves with them and any terrorist organizations that they give shelter to, significant armament, significant weapons. And I think that is an absolutely devastating prospect. And I do believe that other outside nefarious actors are going to be going into Kabul, going into our embassy, going into the computers, as John just mentioned, cyber, which I think is absolutely serious strategic threat. But guaranteed, many of those Afghans who are fleeing and the government offices, even if they're not U.S. confidential documents, are certainly privy to some sort of information. And I believe that nefarious actors are going to be using that information on those computers that have been surrendered as well. And we have no idea just how devastating and how many potential consequences will arise from that.
Liam, come back on that if you would. Micah used the phrase essentially armed the enemies of the United States by way of this. Do you agree with that? And what would be the alternative? How could that have been better handled?
Yeah, no doubt they're more well armed than they were previously. I'm sure they're not carrying around Stinger missiles and those kind of, really, javelins, anti-tank weapons, right? I don't believe those are. Micah, you can correct me. I don't believe we would have given them those capabilities because they didn't really have a need for those capabilities. Really devastating weapons that can take out, our best assets. But I think there's almost always too much of a focus on technology, right? If you look at the Gulf War, right? The Iraqis were armed very well, right? But they didn't employ the proper tactics, right? They didn't have their tanks and hull defilade, turret defilade, right? And so we were able to decimate them out there in the open desert. Right. What's more important is the people, right? As we saw just in this, right? The Taliban obviously had a more committed fighters, right? They had the will. They didn't necessarily have the technology that the Afghanis had, but they had the will. And so for us, right, our advantage, right, is our training, our education, our people, our leadership, what we call mission command. And so, if we have to return to fight the Taliban, are they better armed than they were? Without a doubt. But it comes down to the people more than the technology. The technology just didn't enhance what the capability is.
I want to talk a little bit now about the role that the president plays as the commander-in-chief. That's very distinct from the role that the prime minister or the president in the States of Israel plays. Your president in the United States of America is the commander-in-chief, and he made the following statement. He said, in the face of very, very intensive media opposition and scrutiny and more, he said, quote, "I stand squarely behind my decision. After 20 years, I've learned the hard way that there was never a good time to withdraw U.S. forces." Now, I'm very, very clear, Liam, Micah, John, where all three of you are on the issue of withdrawal, that you've made clear. But how does it feel to have a commander-in-chief and a president who stands up and, at least in my reading and listening to that speech, has taken responsibility for the decision? Not always is that reflected in presidents. Oftentimes, politicians, leaders in other countries as well will seek to place the burden of responsibility on others. He said that the buck stops with him and that he stands squarely behind his decision. What's your feeling as a veteran, each of you? What is your feeling hearing that from the commander-in-chief? And do you accept that statement? Do you think that he didn't, in fact, accept responsibility, as some are saying? And I'm going to start with you, John, if I may.
Yeah, it's an interesting question, Benjamin. I know, I mean, just as we all know, and certainly listeners, I think the U.S. politics now are so toxic and so volatile that it's hard for any statement to be taken in good faith, unfortunately. And I know that was, I had friends and colleagues who I was talking to live during President Biden's remarks, and they were criticizing him for not taking responsibility up front and kind of burying the lead there and coming out with it later. And some even said he engaged in some finger pointing up front and kind of throwing the Trump administration under the bus, so to speak. And so it's hard because, where you sit is where you stand. And so you can see both sides of it, unfortunately, which is not very helpful. But one thing I do keep in mind when President Biden is speaking is he is the father of two U.S. veterans, one of which passed away, tragically of brain cancer. But that is something I don't take lightly. And that's a consideration that I think is important for the American people to remember, considering, President Trump couldn't necessarily say the same, and neither could President Obama. And of course, we know George W. Bush served briefly during the Vietnam War. But I think it's worth noting that he speaks as someone who has put loved ones in harm's way, and he's speaking as a father in those contexts. So I bear that in mind when he speaks, and I appreciate it. I think he is qualified to weigh in as commander-in-chief on those matters.
Liam, your thoughts on that, with him as commander-in-chief, not only making those statements, you can also place them within the broader context of the statement at large, but also I'd like you to talk about the number one, his readiness to come out and to say that he owns this and that he takes responsibility for it. Well, actually, let's start there, Liam. Just tell me your reflections. Specifically, I want to make it clear to everyone, I'm not asking for your views on any partisan aspects. I'm asking for your views, given that it's the commander-in-chief.
Yeah, I'm almost afraid to answer that, Benjamin. Just, as John said, as politicized as our country is.
That's my caveat. Help. Imagine commander-in-chief. I hope so. I hope you can do it.
Imagine that somehow we've been able to politicize a pandemic, right? Something that should bring our nation together, and somehow wearing a mask or getting vaccinated is some kind of a political statement, which is beyond me. So yeah, I mean, almost if I criticize it, then I'm going to be labeled one way, and if I applaud it, then I'm going to be labeled the other, right? And in my work, I remain apolitical, right? Because I'm focused on policy, right? And that it's not party based, but what is good policy? Right. In this case, right, I mean, I applaud him for standing up and saying, right, the buck stops here. But at the same time, right, I could see somebody just saying, well, OK, politically, that was a smart thing to do. What other option did he have? Right. So I could see other, how people could argue either way. It was probably his best policy option to do it, but he still did it. And so I think it's good to say, hey, no, it was his decision, because ultimately it was his decision. Right. And he's to pull them out and to absorb the good and the bad with it. Right. And he acknowledged, right, it probably wasn't done in the best way. But right, I mean, he took ownership of it, and that's what we want.
And Micah, just to bring you in here, how much credit do you assign to the president as commander-in-chief for that statement, that he stands squarely behind his decision? And can you please, if you would, with two considerations. Number one, he did mention that he's been dealing with this subject for close to 20 years. I do think that wisdom and understanding comes across a timeline, whether that's with regard to this president or any other individual. I don't think it ought to be discredited. And number two, he said within that statement that the mission in Afghanistan was to go and interdict and interrupt al-Qaeda, and also to take out Osama bin Laden. So that's an interesting aspect of the statement, because firstly, I believe, if my memory serves, he was someone who actually opposed the strike on bin Laden. I think that I'm correct with that. And yet he's bringing that as credit for his decision-making on this particular issue. And I'd like to know whether you feel that his statement is one from which you can draw solace if you feel that it was a well-considered statement, given the length of time that he's been involved with the Afghanistan issue, or whether you feel that he's getting behind something that, quite frankly, he'd just tired from precisely because of the length of time that he's been dealing with the Afghan theater.
No, thank you, Benjamin. I was very disappointed in President Biden's speech. As John said in his remark, he did eventually say the buck stops with him, but not after blaming everybody else along the way. And I was very disappointed in that. And I do think that, particularly when it comes to the commander-in-chief, action speaks a lot louder than words. And to look back on how many years President Biden has been in public service and as a senator and the rooms that he's been in. And to paraphrase Robert Gates, he's unfortunately been wrong on the vast majority of foreign policy decisions of his career. And this is, in my opinion, definitely one of them. I think the problem with the speech, in particular for me, was that he was focused completely on getting out and ignoring all sorts of consequences that come from that. To really, in my opinion, to ignore all of the allies, not even the Afghan allies, but to not have warned and included our international allies, particularly because the Afghan mission was a NATO mission. And I checked this morning before coming on just to have the most current data possible. It's my belief that he's only actually talked to 2 foreign leaders who have been involved in the Afghan war, Prime Minister Angela Merkel from Germany and Prime Minister Boris Johnson from the UK. And I think at the time of the speech, he had not spoken to any other leaders. And I think that has been a significant issue too, and was problematic that he did not address just how much a fallout this has across the NATO mission in general. For me as an individual soldier, I think I appreciate John mentioning that President Biden has had sons who have served, but I think he ignores just how much was left there. And I very much want to caveat, I had a very privileged deployment. I came home unscathed. I got to work in a very lucky capacity, and compared to many other friends who I've had serve, who I know who have served in very kinetic deployments, I had a very privileged deployment in that sense. So the sacrifice, though, that many people have made, that Gold Star families have made, that people who have lost significant loved ones in Afghanistan, I do not think he addressed properly and understood that the context is more than just about putting people in harm's way, but what they died for. And I do not think that he addressed that at all.
Well, for my last question, as we round out this conversation, I want to ask each of you gentlemen to weigh in on what Micah wrote with regard to attitudes within the veteran community. And Micah wrote at the conclusion of his article, quote, "For my generation of veterans who served, and for those of us who will eventually be in positions of power and influence, I hope that we never forget these images and this moment in history so that we do not make these same mistakes in the future." Obviously, Micah has been consistent throughout this conversation that he views the withdrawal as a mistake. Both of you have taken a different viewpoint, Liam and John. But Micah wraps up by saying, "I hope that we never forget the good that we did for so many Afghan people, and I hope that we never forget that America is a force for good." So with that quote, tell me what you're hearing from among your peers in the veteran community, and tell me how veterans of the Afghan theater, in your opinion, ought to contextualize their service within this dynamic of the withdrawal of US forces from Afghanistan. I'd like to begin with you, Liam, if I may.
Well, I mean, I think most people are disturbed, as you wouldn't be surprised by the images that we're seeing on the media and everything else. And rightfully so. I mean, they invested a lot of time and energy there. Right. I think some might ask, well, what was the point of what we did over there? But I mean, you can't base a policy decision on sunk costs, no matter how, right. And we're talking, I'm using an economic term, but right, the sunk costs are people, right, and dollars, but the people being the critical one. But again, I mean, go back to making sure we learn what the lesson is, and the lesson is, as I kind of said multiple times, we created the conditions for this, that where we're at today. We created that back in 2002 and 2004 and kind of throughout our deployments there. And so we shouldn't be surprised that where we're at today, just like in Iraq, right? We basically, if you could write a textbook of how to create an insurgency, we would have followed every play in that, right? By just de-Ba'athifying and taking everybody out of government and really giving the Sunnis no other option but to turn to Al-Qaeda in Iraq. And so, that's what I would say. Is it disturbing? Yes, but it's still right. We had to pull out of there.
John, your thoughts on that and what you would say to other vets? Firstly, what are you hearing from other vets, and how would you say that they ought to contextualize their role in Afghanistan now that the withdrawal has taken place?
Yeah, well, as Colonel Collins mentioned, I would say veterans I'm in touch with are disappointed. Some have stronger reactions than others based on, as Micah mentioned, their own direct involvement and kind of making sense of it. I don't see this as a Vietnam 2.0. I think we're in a much better place as a society. I think military service is well respected. We'll have to answer the question of what their service meant. And at the end of the day, it's a deeply personal question. And it's not an easy one to answer. And so I think the best thing we can do is come together as a group and reflect and do our best to share our gifts with the world and make positive meaning out of our time in service.
And Micah, your thoughts on the same, please.
Well, I think as everybody who's viewing in on this conversation, it's clear the vets community is not a monolith, and I really respect John and Liam's opinion and respect the fact that we do disagree on just how we're processing and viewing everything that's going on based on our own collective service and the people we know and as well. And so I think it runs a gamut. And from everybody I've talked to and in numerous veteran group chats, it really is a spectrum. There are people who really are just glad we're out, done, never want to think about it again. And then I've had calls this week where I feel like I had to talk people off the ledge in regards to just how concerned they are and they are taking this much harder than I am or than I can possibly imagine. And so it really is just you cannot quantify it in one particular person's perspective, identity, or opinion.
Thank you. Reiterated thanks to each of you. And we look forward to our next conversation. And this concludes our discussion about the US withdrawal from Afghanistan. Thank you very much indeed, gentlemen.
Thanks for having us, Benjamin.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support JBS with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double high or more. Simply visit the JBS website at jbstv.org and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check to JBS, Post Office Box 360, Stamford, Connecticut 06904. Or you can call the JBS Pledge Line at 833-MY-JBS-TV. That's 833-695-2788. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive with our compliments. We thank you for your kind support.